Welcome to tonight's webinar. I am Adisa Alkebulan, Chair and Associate Professor of Africana Studies at San Diego State University. 2022 marks the 50th anniversary of the Department of Africana Studies. Our theme is Africana Studies at 50, a retrospective of art, activism, and scholarship, and I thank you for joining us for tonight's event, Black Radical Perspectives on Ukraine. Margaret Kimberley is executive editor of Black Agenda Report. She is the author of the book Prejudicial, Black America and the Presidents. She is also a contributor to the anthologies In Defense of Julian Assange and Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Ms. Kimberley is a coordinating committee member of Black Alliance for Peace and an administrative committee member of the United National Anti-War Coalition. She is also a recipient of the Serena Shim Award for Uncompromising Integrity in Journalism and the Women's Institute for Freedom of the Press 2021 Women in Media Award. She is a board member of the Consortium News and the editorial board of the International Manifesto Group. Her work can also be seen at Patreon, patreon.com/Margaret Kimberley. Ajamu Baraka is an internationally recognized leader of the emerging human rights movement in the United States and has been at the forefront of efforts to apply the international human rights framework to social justice advocacy in the United States for more than 25 years. As such, she has provided human rights training for grassroots activists across the country, briefings on human rights to Congress, and appeared before and provided statements to various United Nations agencies, including the UN Human Rights Commission, precursor to the current UN Human Rights Council. Baraka has also served on the boards of various national and international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International USA, the Center for Constitutional Rights, Africa Action, and the Mississippi Workers Center for Human Rights. Both of our guests will give opening statements, and we'll start with Margaret Kimberley.
Thank you. Thank you so very much. I'm very happy to be here. Greetings, everyone. I first, of course, want to thank Adisa Alkebulan and San Diego State's Department of Africana Studies for inviting us tonight. I appreciate having every opportunity to discuss this situation in Ukraine because it is so important, yet it's so poorly understood. And that lack of understanding is by design. It is intentional on the part of the Biden administration, the Democratic and Republican parties, and their friends in corporate media. Despite millions of words printed and hours of broadcasting, I can safely say that 95% of what we're told about Ukraine is untrue and therefore is useless to us. What is the Black interest in Ukraine? I've heard some people say that we don't have one at all. They say that these are white nations fighting each other and that this crisis has no meaning for us. But we live here in the country that just announced it will no longer reimburse healthcare providers for COVID tests, vaccines, and treatment for the uninsured, where we're told that providing free healthcare is too expensive. This same country, however, allocated more money, an additional $13 billion in 1 week's time, for Ukraine to fight a war when it ought to be helping to broker a peace. Our needs cannot be met if the military-industrial complex is enriched at our expense, and if these far-right forces in Ukraine attract like-minded people from around the world, turning itself into a magnet for fascists, neo-Nazis, and white supremacists. It should also go without saying that we ought to be interested in the whole world, and Black people shouldn't need a special reason to pay attention to any issue. I think we should start with some basic facts about Ukraine. It's not a noble, independent nation, nor is its president the heroic man portrayed by corporate media. Ukraine is under the grip of far-right forces and kleptocrats, and it is a de facto colony of the US, which helped those far-right forces overthrow the elected president in 2014. But the Donbass region in the east, Russian speaking and left wing, in fact, still feeling a connection with the Soviet Union, resisted the coup government. Civil war ensued, which resulted in more than 14,000 deaths. But the Minsk II agreement showed a path to peace. It was signed by Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and France, and was approved unanimously in the United Nations Security Council in 2015. But Minsk II was never acted upon because the Obama administration and the Trump administration and the Biden administration did not want peace in Ukraine. They want to continue controlling it, to potentially make it a NATO member and use it as a weapon against Russia. Peace was not in their interest, and now it is very late. It is clear that Russian troops won't be leaving anytime soon, and certainly won't leave the Donetsk and Lugansk republics of the Donbass unprotected. Of course, the first rule of Black radical analysis of Ukraine is to say quite clearly that Black people should not be on the side of the US and NATO. They are the cause of great suffering for African and African descended people. And far from being the defensive organization that it claims to be, NATO is an aggressor and often operates far from the North Atlantic region it says it is protecting. NATO has brought destruction to millions of people from Ukraine to Libya to Afghanistan. NATO nations back coups and other interventions in Africa, occupied Haiti, and act as US proxies. The South American nation Colombia, far from the North Atlantic, has been designated a NATO partner. More broadly speaking, we should always be anti-imperialist. That should be the goal of everyone on the left, and especially for those who make any claim of following Black radical positions. Imperialism is personified by the US and its allies. The US has the world reserve currency, 800 military bases around the world, and spends more on defense than the next 11 nations combined, 10 times more than Russia spends, by the way. The Black radical tradition requires clear opposition to US foreign policy, which is never carried out on behalf of people's needs anywhere in the world. That tradition requires that we detach ourselves from the prevalent ideology of this country. And by that, I mean white supremacy and American exceptionalism. That may seem obvious, but it is less obvious in the ways in which they are communicated to us. We are exhorted to identify with this government and with its actions, even when they are clearly wrong. We are told that certain world leaders are good or bad when the criteria is nothing more than adherence to US policy. Of course, we Americans are very much indoctrinated, so it may seem strange at first, but it's necessary. And any difficulty in changing language or thought is in fact evidence of the indoctrination that we're exposed to. But that's what we must identify if we're going to have a meaningful conversation about Ukraine or any other place in the world. I think it's essential to decipher corporate media and understand the role they play in amplifying the state narrative. For years, Russian President Vladimir Putin has been vilified more than any other world leader in modern times. He's depicted as a tyrant, a dictator, and a modern day Hitler, who allegedly stole the 2016 election for Donald Trump. He didn't, but that's another story. People who call themselves journalists routinely ask if he's a killer or a war criminal. The end result is that any narrative that explains Russia's positions is dismissed. After all, one should not give credence to anything a Hitler has to say. But that means Russia's concerns about the US placing an anti-Russian government on its border is to be ignored. The expansion of NATO and its implications for Russia are to be ignored. Russia has now been declared illegitimate itself, and Russian artists are harangued to denounce their government or go without work. And even cats cannot compete in international cat shows, and Tchaikovsky is stricken from music festivals. The media are not just ratcheting up hatred for the Russian government, they are cheerleaders for war. So-called journalists asked if we, in quotes, should call Putin's bluff and risk war with another nuclear power. They repeat questions about a no-fly zone, which isn't as benign as it sounds. It should be called a plane shooting each other down and leading to a hot war zone, because that is what it really means. I think it will help to analyze what is true about Ukraine and its leadership versus what we have been told. President Volodymyr Zelensky was the hand-picked candidate of a Ukrainian oligarch named Igor Kolomoisky. Kolomoisky is a citizen of Ukraine, Israel, and Cyprus, and owns a Ukrainian television network which featured the actor Zelensky in a comedy about a Ukrainian president. Kolomoisky himself was sanctioned by the US State Department in March of 2021 for, quote, involvement in significant corruption, unquote. He and other billionaires purchased properties in small Midwestern towns as a means of laundering money. Kolomoisky was accused by the Justice Department and Ukrainian investigators of using shell companies and offshore bank accounts to move millions in misappropriated funds out of Ukraine and into a series of real estate investments in this country. Investigators allege that Kolomoisky was overseeing one of the greatest Ponzi schemes the world has ever seen, totaling at least $5 billion. Filings from American prosecutors detail how he allegedly used control of Ukraine's largest bank, Privat Bank, to loot money from Ukrainian depositors and then use shell companies and offshore accounts to hide his money in the US. My goal in pointing this out is to explain why it's so important to investigate for ourselves, lest we add blue and yellow flags to our social media profiles without thinking about what we're doing. The last thing we want is to be supportive of one of the world's worst kleptocracies, and that is exactly what Ukraine is. If Zelensky was put into office by a crook, then by definition, he can't be the man we're told to respect, who gets standing ovations when he speaks to Congress. Zelensky himself has shut down opposition television stations, and this week banned left-wing opposition parties. And lastly, while no one accuses Zelensky of being a neo-Nazi himself, the Ukrainian government and oligarchs use fascists as their enforcers. These groups openly threaten politicians, including Zelensky himself. The fact that Zelensky is Jewish proves nothing about these influences. Kolomoisky is also a backer of the Azov battalion. He has also bankrolled his own private militias. The history goes back a long way, all the way to Stepan Bandera, who during World War II openly supported the Nazis who occupied Ukraine and killed so many of its citizens. But war propaganda, we must call it what it is, has disappeared this history. The same corporate media outlets also downplayed the thousands of neo-Nazis, fascists, and white supremacists from all over the world who have descended on Ukraine. The Russian army takes them more seriously than the media do and sent missiles to these Foreign Legion barracks and killed scores of them. Here's a short video of a Brazilian named Tiago Rossi, a supporter of President Bolsonaro, talking about his narrow escape and acknowledging the presence of so many foreign fighters. Video, please.
Sim, eu não sei nem o que falar. Lá tinha militares das forças especiais do mundo inteiro. Tinha da França, toda a Europa, tinha da Coreia do Sul, tinha do Chile, Estados Unidos, Canadá. Cara, o mundo inteiro estava lá, o mundo inteiro. Militares das forças especiais do mundo inteiro estavam lá. E simplesmente todo mundo, a informação que a gente tem, todo mundo morreu. Eles conseguiram acabar com tudo. Vocês não estão entendendo o que é um caça soltar o míssil em cima da gente. Vocês não estão entendendo. Acabou, acabou. A legião foi exterminada de uma vez só. Graças a Deus que eu saí antes. Graças a Deus.
Thanks. It goes without saying that no one who's following the Black radical tradition should be on the side of neo-Nazis and white supremacists. This week is the 19th anniversary of George W. Bush's invasion of Iraq and the 10-year anniversary of the no-fly zone resolution in the United States, in the United Nations, which began Barack Obama's destruction of Libya. We should remember that, as Malcolm X said, the media can make the innocent look guilty and the guilty innocent. How else can one explain why the media don't ask if Bush and Obama aren't war criminals themselves. The only way for Joe Biden to escape this designation is to work for peace. He could very easily end this conflict and end the suffering of people in Ukraine. Thank you. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Ms. Kimberley. Mr. Baraka.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me for this very important conversation, something that we know that people are engaged in across the country, because this issue is an important one and quite confusing for many, but is vitally important for us in particular as African people to be absolutely clear about what is unfolding in Ukraine. Because it has implications not only for the world, of course, but specifically for Africa, the African working class, and the colonized peoples of this planet. Because what we see, my friends, is a situation unfolding right now in Ukraine that is sort of captures the contradictions that the Pan-European project is facing in their desperate attempt to try to maintain their global hegemony. The Pan-European project we are referring to, of course, is that project that developed once the Europeans spilled out of Europe in 1492 into the Americas and began the process of conquering the peoples of the Americas, enslaved and transported Africans to the Americas, all with the intent of enriching themselves. That process provided the material basis for what emerged as Europe and so-called Western civilization. It served as the material base for that development. That was the beginning of the gradual ascendancy of European power. In the 19th century, of course, it was consolidated globally as the Europeans began to move to a different phase of the colonial process. But that different development in the 19th century created its own contradictions among themselves that eventually led to the First Imperialist War and then the Second Imperialist War. And we say that, and we raise that issue of war because at the center of this process of colonialism, its core instrument that is used is in fact violence, state violence, all kinds of forms of violence. And that has been that violence that has been the driving force for the ascendancy of Europe. And in fact, it is the driving force that US and Western policymakers are leaning on today in order to try to maintain their global hegemony. It's important that we understand that, because when you understand that this issue of violence and war is not the consequence of just evil individuals, but represents a certain kind of logic, a logic that suggests that when you understand the logic, that it makes no sense to appeal to the consciousness or the conscience of these individuals who are making policies in Europe and in the US. You have to understand that what has to take place is to ensure that these individuals don't have the power to take the rest of us down with them as they are experiencing their precipitous decline as a global force. This latest adventure on the part of Europeans under the hegemony of US capital in Ukraine is representative of their attempt to try to, in fact, maintain their power and expand it through violence. It's important that we understand that while the issue on the surface is issues around the expansion of NATO, the security concerns, of course, of the Russians. Underneath that, underlying those security concerns are in fact the economic interests of the US and Western Europe, and primarily the US. The objective of the US with the Ukrainian crisis that they manufactured was twofold. One, it was to disarticulate the Russian economy from the Western European economy. And secondly, it was to fundamentally undermine Russia in order for it to be less attractive as a partner with the Chinese, because the real, one of the real objectives of this action in Ukraine is in fact China. So this, these policies, and we're going to talk about this, these policies we see with this manufactured crisis, the violence that they are committed to, that's reflected in their public documents, their commitment to what they refer to as full spectrum dominance, is captured in the manufactured crisis of Ukraine. They are committed to violence in order to maintain their hegemony. And what that says for us is we have to counter that with the power of the organized people. That if we are not able to organize an effective opposition, a global opposition to the rule of capital, to the continuation of this Western European colonial capitalist project, then it appears, and I think we're all concerned that before these forces are prepared to relinquish political power, they will in fact take us all down with them. We see the dangerous events that Margaret alluded to, this reckless conversation around the possibility of a no-fly zone in Ukraine, and the fact that significant numbers of people in the US support that. And that understanding its implications, that when you have a no-fly zone, you have to establish the conditions for that to in fact be effective. And that means a military confrontation in order to ensure that your pilots are in fact safe. And what that suggests is that in this case, is the possibility of a direct confrontation between the NATO pilots and the Russian pilots that can easily escalate into a more serious confrontation that can lead to a catastrophic exchange of nuclear weapons that we would not survive as a human species on this planet. So all of this suggests to us that we have to have an effective anti-war and anti-imperialist movement. It's one thing to be anti-war and to be pro-peace. That's very important. It has a very strong moral component to it. But the anti-imperialist perspective is also vital. In fact, it's fundamental, because it is grounded in an understanding that what is driving these policies are in fact material interests. And that's why we say that for us to really understand Ukraine, we have to decenter Ukraine, decenter Europe, and keep the focus on imperialism. It is imperialism that's driving these processes. And what that means, my friends, is that we have to, again, confront these forces in order to be able to shift power from them to the masses of our people. And that is really our task. That's our historic task, not only for ourselves, but also for the generations coming after us. It's going to be a titanic struggle because these forces are prepared to do whatever it takes to maintain their power. But we have to be just as vigilant, just as committed to our own futures, just as dedicated to the idea that we can be more than what we are today, that we can in fact build a better world and a brighter future, if you will. But it's going to take struggle. It's going to take sacrifice. But I think that we are up to the task. There are millions of people around the world that understand that for us to be liberated, that's going to take this struggle, and they are more than prepared to join us in this fight. So we say, as we talk about this tonight, that we need to discuss the role of Black and colonized people in this struggle. We have to discuss how we attempt to help people understand what their interests are as opposed to the interests of the US state. We need to take a serious look at the media and how the role that the media is playing in whipping up a war hysteria, war frenzy. And we have to talk about how we in fact build the kind of consciousness and opposition that will ensure that we are in a place to win. And that's really what we're all about. We're about trying to win. So these are my opening comments, and I'm looking forward to our conversation to talk about how we in fact move forward.
Okay, thank you both for your opening comments, and I think that you did a great job with setting the context for this evening's discussion. The first question that I have is really to provide some context from perhaps Russia's perspective, or what might be motivating Russia. I think the broader conversation that we're obviously going to have, is a Black radical perspective, but I think that it would be instructive for folks to kind of have an understanding of what the historic relationship is between Ukraine and Russia, perhaps post the fall of the Soviet Union, the significance, of the Minsk agreement, Crimea, the other Eastern region. So if you could kind of provide that background and context, I think we could move forward to, having a broader understanding of the conflict.
You said since the fall of the Soviet Union?
Yeah.
Well, it's, Ukraine has an interesting history, a very diverse population, but that also means there are a lot of divisions within the country. And after the early 90s, I think the most important thing for the purpose of our conversation is to talk about how the US and NATO have encroached upon Russia even after there was no Soviet Union. So NATO was supposed to protect from the Soviet Union. Well, then there is no Soviet Union. So what do you need NATO for? In this case, it was to encroach upon Russia quite literally by adding former Soviet bloc countries, some former Soviet republics. So Ukraine was always a target of the United States, wanting to pull it out of Russia's orbit. And they, in 24, I know this is very oversimplified, but anyway, I'm sure Ajamu can help fill in where I don't take the time to go. The US pulled off a coup against the elected president and took sides in this conflict that the people of Ukraine had themselves. And this has been going on intermittently since the early 90s. There would be elections, there would be violent uprisings against particular presidents, but this time they had the US behind them. This was seen, and I think we should be able to understand why, a threat to Russia. And as for Crimea, Russia has a naval base there and did not want to lose it to the new coup government. The population of Crimea is mostly Russian, actually. Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Republic until the 50s, and Khrushchev, who was Ukrainian, apparently in a deal he wanted to get support, gave it to Ukraine. But the population is mostly Russian, and they did vote to become part of Russia and not part of Ukraine. The Ukrainians obviously did not like that. And we have been told ever since this time that this was a lie. Their allegiance to Russia was not true. But I think it's pretty clear from people who know what they're talking about that that's the case, the ties of the people in Crimea to Russia. But so now here we are in the present day after several Ukrainian presidents. Let's not forget that Joe Biden was the Ukraine point person in the Obama administration, and he came into office, he and his team, the Victoria Nulands and the Antony Blinkens. Victoria Nuland, lest we forget, was caught in a yakking on an unsecured phone in 2014, talking about which president she wanted Ukraine to have. So nobody can claim that the US was not involved. So these people come back. Biden, goads the Ukrainians into attacking the Donbass, and then having, as Ajamu touched on, a pretext for sanctions against Russia. So I hope that was kind of clear. It's a lot of information to put in a few minutes. But.
And I'll just jump in and add to that. I think very, very detailed response. Just to remind our listeners that what we had with the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s was in fact a sort of a power vacuum, if you will. That it eliminated the countervailing power to the US. And as a consequence, we saw a series of quite reckless activity on the part of the US without any kind of restraint on its power. It engaged in a number of policies, including the invading and attacking Iraq in the early 1990s, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and then the bombing of Serbia, of course, in 1999, and then the what ended up being one of the most catastrophic, if you will, decisions, which was that the US could in fact fight two wars simultaneously. And so it went into Afghanistan, and then it went into Iraq. So what we saw with the collapse of the Soviet Union was an increase in the use of military force on the part of the US. They would paint their interventions in these really glowing kind of framing that their interventions were in fact not interventions meant to advance their selfish economic interests, but they were intervening into various nations because of concerns around repression. So their interventions were humanitarian interventions. And that was constructed, that framing was constructed to bring the US public with them as they engage in consolidating and expanding their unraveled global power. But today the situation has changed, and that's what is the issue with the current Biden administration. As Margaret alluded to, in 2014, when the Obama-Biden administration engineered the coup in Ukraine, that's when the Ukrainians lost their national sovereignty. And why did they have the coup? Well, because there was the possibility of the Ukrainians joining the European family, if you will, with a European association. The president, Viktor Yanukovych, was negotiating with the Europeans and negotiating with the Russians. But in the end, what was being offered by the Europeans did not seem to provide the kind of independence that the government of Ukraine was looking for. In fact, it was an agreement that would have been the outright colonization of the West of Ukraine by Western powers. And so Yanukovych decided to go with the Russian offer. As soon as that decision was made, the coup was unleashed, the unrest in the streets. Victoria Nuland was the point person on the ground. And as Margaret indicated, the overall coordinator of that and point person was in fact Joe Biden. The result was the coup in February 2014. The coup that many people in parts of the country, in particular in the eastern part of the country, did not recognize. I mean, how many people would recognize a coup when you voted for a president, but then these forces aligned with foreign forces engineer a coup and call it a revolution? So in the eastern part of Ukraine, where the people had voted heavily for Viktor Yanukovych, they did not recognize the coup government. What was the response from the coup government? They characterized them as domestic terrorists and basically unleashed a war against their own citizens. The same thing that, or the same activity, same behavior that the US supposedly criticized the Syrians for attacking their own citizens. But what they did, what the US did and the propagandists did was to basically remove these Ukrainians from the Ukrainian nation state by a process of categorical conversion. They became not Ukrainian citizens, but pro-Russian separatists, which meant basically you could do anything to them because they weren't really Ukrainians. So a war ensued. I'm gonna make this a little bit simpler and less detailed. I didn't mean to do this. But the result was basically there was a military stalemate, a negotiated settlement that Margaret alluded to called the Minsk Agreement was in place. This was an agreement that was going to maintain the integrity of Ukraine. It was going to give, though, significant autonomy to the eastern part of the country, the so-called Donbass. And it was going to lead toward, supposed to be a ceasefire. They were going to not deploy heavy weapons, et cetera, et cetera. That was basically violated over the subsequent years. That was put in place in 2015. From 2015 until 2021, something like 14,000 people lost their lives, primarily in the Donbass region. So a war ensued from 2014 till the present. So when people say that the war started with the invasion of Ukraine by the Russians, that's not really true. That's not historically correct. The war started back in 2014. And the people who were dying disproportionately were in fact the people of the Donbass. So these are important issues to understand, because the propaganda efforts to try to paint the Ukrainians as this pro-democracy, innocent state is just an outright lie. Another issue that we need to be mindful of is that with the ascendancy of this coup government in 2014, something very curious began to happen. Because of the nature of many of the forces that were in the government, and these forces were, some of them were literal neo-Nazis, and the US authorities knew that, okay? They were ultra-right nationalist neo-Nazis with long-standing ties to the ultra-right and neo-Nazi movements for decades, going back to the Second Imperialist War, known as World War II. Now, they were still a minority in the population politically, but they ended up having significant influence in the new state. They were the ones that took over the security agencies or apparatus. They were the deputy prime minister, okay? And everybody knew that this influence was in fact there. Now, on the non-state level, you had another phenomenon. You had ultra-right nationalists, neo-Nazis from around the world traveling to Ukraine because Ukraine became the epicenter of the international white supremacist movement. Something like over 17,000 individuals from 50 different countries traveled to Ukraine after 2015 to receive both ideological and military training. All of this is documented. Everybody knew this. So, you know, this is the character of that particular state. And we need to understand it in particular for African and colonized people who've been on the receiving end of this kind of white supremacist activity, that we have to have our eyes wide open, because we see that the Western powers will align themselves with any force in order to advance their short-term interests, be it jihadists or, in this case, these white supremacists. And what we see with this alignment that they're making with this white supremacist movement, the Azam battalion that now is being hammered in Ukraine, is that it's almost a replay of what they did back in the 1980s when they basically brought together these jihadist forces from around the world to bog down the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and in the process created the network Al-Qaeda. Okay, now are we seeing a replay of that with the international white supremacist movement, allowing these mercenaries coming from all these different countries to engage in this glorious fight against the Russians in Ukraine? These individuals, most of them are in fact white supremacists. You know, are we creating the same kind of phenomenon that this time all of us, in particular non-Europeans, will be subjected to their brutality? So we can't have any illusions about what is really in play with this Ukrainian situation.
Thank you. My next several questions were actually about neo-Nazis in Ukraine, and both of you, answered my questions before I could ask them. So thank you for that. But I'll still try and ask a little bit of it, and perhaps we could, spend a little bit more time talking about it. And we know that the Obama administration, pretty much led NATO in, assisting, Ukraine, or I'm sorry, assisting, the opposition in Ukraine to overthrow the democratically elected government. But I want you to speak to the irony of, and perhaps irony is not even a good word when we kind of understand who and what, Obama was, particularly, the role that he played in destroying Libya, for example. But I'll still follow that path for the sake of conversation. But the irony of the Obama administration really joining forces with neo-Nazis in their takeover in Ukraine. And as you both just spoke to, the neo-Nazis are still, factoring, albeit a minority, but still factoring heavily into the conflict and the fighting now. But if you could just speak broadly about, that irony and the role of the Obama administration, or more specifically, the role of Barack Obama in that coup. And then we'll open the questions up from the Q&A area.
Well, Obama was president of the United States. He did everything every other president did, represents the same interests. And so we shouldn't be surprised that he would actually accelerate what many of them had already done. And sadly, being the first Black president, he actually was given cover. So you mentioned Libya. I believe if any other president had been in office, a white president, then I think there would have been protests, there would have been pushback, there would have at least been some harsh words about what happened there. But the US presidency is a white supremacist office, and it doesn't matter if the person who sits in the big desk in the Oval Office is not a white person. So that's I suppose that's the irony of Obama for so many issues, that by virtue of the office of the presidency, he would not represent the interests of Black people, of colonized people. The president of the United States is the person in charge of the aggression, and the person in charge of the full spectrum dominance carried out by the US and by NATO, their allies.
Yeah, I would add to that yeah, it's so it's really no irony. It is, as Margaret said, it is the function of that office to advance the interests of the most powerful forces in the state. And the most powerful forces in the US state is representative of the finance capital, of transnational capital, transnational corporations based in the US. And that's his role. And they found under Obama, as they have other Democratic presidents, the advantage of being able to engage in some of the most aggressive behavior one can imagine without significant political opposition. We reference, for example, the 1990s. The president that occupied the White House in the 1990s after George Herbert Walker Bush, of course, was Bill Clinton for the most of the 1990s. And we saw again that there was a commitment to a military first strategy without much opposition from the public, because the Democrats aren't the war party, supposedly. Okay, under Barack Obama, we had some of the most horrendous crimes against humanity and war crimes committed that one can imagine. The Obama-Biden administration was responsible for the coup in Honduras, the coup in Ukraine, the coup in Egypt, the war against Syria, the re-invasion of Iraq, the surge in Afghanistan, the consolidation and expansion of the U.S. Africa Command on the African continent, and of course, the attack against the most prosperous and most politically advanced state on the African continent, Libya. This individual and that administration was one of the most criminal administrations, probably from the period of the Second World War. So that is the role of the Obama administration. So the Ukraine situation was just one aspect of their commitment to full spectrum dominance. Full spectrum dominance, or the doctrine of full spectrum dominance, is their national security strategy. That basically what it means is that they want to maintain global hegemony. And part of that translates into any regional state that poses any kind of threat to their hegemony in that region will be destroyed, be it Libya on the African continent, Venezuela in Latin America, Russia in Europe. That is part of what they do. And of course, remember, it's under the Obama administration that they initiated the so-called pivot to Asia, the military pivot to Asia, to do what? To contain the Chinese. So all this, BS about free enterprise and the working of the international markets, all of that is a bunch of nonsense that basically it boils down to, and they have demonstrated this through their own behavior, naked power, military power. So when you understand that, then you understand what the terms of our resistance must be. It ain't about trying to bring in somebody who's nice. These individuals are bought and paid for by the capitalist class. We have a capitalist dictatorship in the United States of America, and this so-called democracy, this process democracy, is nothing but a convenient shell for that political and class reality.
So there are two interesting questions about the media in the chat, and I'm going to try and combine those two questions. So on the one hand, one of the participants is asking about the manipulation by the media that advances the government, the US government's position, their policies with regard to Ukraine and Russia. So if you could, speak to the role of the US media in this conflict, but also on the other hand, respond to arguments regarding Russia's disinformation campaign over the last couple of years, targeting, and this is their question, not mine, over the last couple of years, targeting African Americans in the United States, like through Ghanaian troll farms. So the disinformation, the idea of a disinformation campaign on the US side and the campaign on the Russian side.
Well, the amount of war propaganda that we've seen in the last month has just been incredible. I have never seen anything like this in my life. Wall-to-wall coverage, all saying the same thing. The absence of any narrative that differs from that of the presidential administration. I remember, I just said it's 19 years since the invasion of Iraq. I remember they occasionally let someone have an op-ed in the New York Times or Washington Post who said this was not a good idea, but now there has been a total shutdown. People being told to, can't find Ukraine on a map, but get a blue and yellow flag, and anything that differs from this must be Russian propaganda. So Russia equals bad. The partners of the state, social media, censoring, kicking people off of the platforms that we need to use in order to be heard. It is truly been I think of myself as a cynic, and so nothing should shock me, but I'm going to admit that this level of indoctrination, of war propaganda, has been very, very shocking to me. As far as troll farms go, and Russian troll farms, there was a clumsy effort by the Russians to use people in the African continent to talk to Black Americans. It was a bit sad, actually. But the biggest troll farms are here. Those are the slickest troll farms. The White House had started one last week. They had a meeting with TikTok influencers on the subject of Ukraine. And I remember posting, so the White House is going to have a troll farm. And who needs a troll farm when the New York Times and Washington Post and NPR and PBS repeat what you say word for word? So any little effort the Russians made was nothing like what we see every day. We have a state media. I know Twitter will say, someone is Chinese state media or Russian state media, which is helpful because it means I should follow them. That's the way I look at it. But the New York Times is state media. All of those outlets I just mentioned are arms of the state, and they act accordingly. So, any notions of having a free press are gone, and people should not be, we should not be surprised, and we should understand why they are doing what they do. And sometimes it's things that are minor, that seem to be silly. Yesterday, there was it was over the weekend, about Russian cosmonauts who dressed in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. And it just was not true. All you had to do was look at the picture. Their uniform was yellow, that's correct, this yellow jumpsuit, and the blue was the blue in the Russian flag. It was just so obvious, and it may seem minor and silly, but some of the propaganda is very heavy-handed, some of it is more subtle, but when you combine it, you have a population that unfortunately is being prepared to go to war, to do things that are very, very dangerous. and not just Russia against China too. I'm digressing a little bit. The Chinese official was interviewed on Face the Nation yesterday, and the interviewer was terribly rude to him, interrupting him, basically calling him a liar. I don't know what the point was of having, well, the point of having him on was to beat up on China. And so the troll farms, the manipulation, the war propaganda is off the charts right here. And we don't have to look to another country.
Exactly. And we have to be very, very careful about this notion of disinformation being directed toward Black people, because many of us who are in fact critics, who are in fact attempting to, in the tradition of our opposition, to build political opposition, to build movement, who have a critical understanding of the world, it's very easy for the propagandists to suggest that we are attempting to amplify the positions of the Chinese or the Russians or whatever. And that's geared toward trying to shut down critical thought, critical analysis. But we are Black revolutionaries. We can think for ourselves. We have our own set of assumptions, our own set of interests that are not going to be in alignment with the assumptions and interests of the US settler colonial state. And we have no problem saying that, okay? So the enemy of this state is not necessarily going to be our enemy, okay? Now, folks who identify with being quote unquote an American, you know, that's your choice. And you can send your kids off to fight for your state. You can hate who they hate, but that's your choice. But understand this, that many of us are not going to go down that route. We understand who we are, and we understand what our objective interests are. And it's not the interests of this 1% of the population that really control things in this country. We absolutely clear about that. So just be careful, folks, because you know those of us who are attempting to maintain the integrity of our oppositional movement, we are facing incredible scrutiny and pressure, including the Black Agenda report that Margaret is the lead editor on, publisher, and those of us who work with and publish. You know, they are attempting to shut down all opposition. And the opposition they're the most concerned about is the Black radical opposition, especially a radical opposition that has a clear understanding of the terms of struggle. So be very careful, folks. This notion of Russian disinformation and all of this targeting Black folks, you know, all this came out of that silly, that ridiculous Russian Gate BS, you know, but it stuck with a lot of people. But, you know, we got to be careful because these folks are serious about trying to maintain their power, and they will use and manipulate any and everyone they can to, in fact, do that.
So I'm going to connect two other questions together, and they're both dealing with propaganda and the media. So if you could speak to those quickly so that we can, you know, move on to some other topics, but I think that they're good questions. So on the one hand, could you speak to the rhetoric of comparing Putin to Hitler and Zelensky speaking of the Holocaust to the Knesset? And then also, what do you think of Zelensky's use of the MLK speech in an appeal to Congress?
Well, scoundrels often quote Martin Luther King, so that wasn't at all surprising. As you know, Zelensky is a puppet, as I you know pointed out. He is a puppet of the Ukrainian oligarchic class, and people talk about Russian oligarchs. Ukraine is completely controlled by oligarchs. And it was a put-up job. He was the person they chose at this moment. He's not a serious figure, even though he's in this serious position. So you can't pay a lot of attention to him. He's clearly under a lot of stress. He will say contradictory things in the same statement, in the same press conference. He'll say up first and then he'll say down. He's no one to be taken seriously, quite frankly. So I didn't get too offended when he, talked about having a dream. I think that's what he said in Congress. He's pretty much like scoundrel politicians here when he did that. As far as this connection with of Putin to Hitler, it is very dangerous. It's ahistorical, bears no basis in any fact. And what it does is it makes, as I was pointing out, makes illegitimate anything that Russia has to say. So there can be no talk of diplomacy, right? Because if he's Hitler, then you're an appeaser. If you do anything but, what are you supposed to do with Hitler? Defeat Hitler in a war. So it is meant to prime people for war. It's meant to shut down any dialogue, any debate. And so now we see people in their zeal, in their effort to try to move this project forward, they end up being the Nazi minimizers. There are some very prominent people on Twitter and so forth saying that Putin is actually worse than Hitler. This man from the former Soviet Union, from Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, the city that suffered more under the Nazis than any place else in Russia, whose older brother died, whose mother nearly starved to death in that terrible siege. People are comparing him to Hitler. And it's quite disgraceful that the media promote these tropes, but the purpose is to ready us, to prepare us for whatever the government should choose to do that we ought to be opposing. And this is not a question you asked me, but what should we be doing? We should be demanding peace. This could be over. If the United States would deal in good faith, this could be, it never would have happened, and it could end. But this business of calling everybody Hitler is, it's extremely dangerous, and especially to refer to Vladimir Putin that way.
And I think it's important to point out, so there's no confusion here, that we are clear about the nature of all of these various states. The Russian Federation is not a revolutionary state. The Russian Federation is a capitalist state, like the other capitalist states. But at this stage in the development of capital and the crisis of capital, we are finding with the decline of the U.S. A situation almost very similar to what we saw in pre-World War I. This attempt to redivide the planet that's already been divided, which means then you have these clashes between these various states, capitalist states, that always have historically led to conflict and in fact to war. So what we are saying is we just need to be absolutely clear for ourselves, because we don't want to see our people, really anybody, being caught up in aligning themselves with interests that are counter to their interests. We don't need to be lining up with the U.S. bourgeoisie against the capitalist classes in Russia, for example. So while the focus has been on the U.S., because that's our main focus, we're not the dupes of anybody. We understand what is in play here. And that's why, we say, look, what are the underlying issues here? And the underlying issue from my perspective is, in talking about Ukraine and Europe, is in fact the attempt on the part of the Biden administration to reassert its hegemony over Europe and the over 500 individuals that make up the European market. And how did you do that? One thing you do is you undermine your main competitor. Remember this, folks. Who's the number one arms seller on the planet? The U.S. Who's number two? The Russian Federation. The fracking industry that was in dire straits a year ago, they are seeing their possible deliverance with being able to replace Russian oil and gas with their liquefied natural gas from the U.S. But that will be threatened if you have the Nord Stream 2 come online that allows for Russian gas to be transported from Russia straight to Germany and to the rest of the European market. So there are underlying economic issues here that we have to keep in mind, because that is what's driving these conflicts. So we say, look, let's just be clear about what's really in play and understand the manipulation game. One of the reasons why this Ukrainian situation exploded when it did, in my opinion, is related to domestic politics. Also, here you have a Biden administration, a failed administration. They have not delivered on any of their major commitments to the U.S. public. None of the campaign promises or commitments have really been fulfilled, except now they have won the infrastructure bill, which is nothing but another gift to the capitalist class. They bungled the COVID situation. They were not able to deliver on Build Back Better. They played around with the issue of voting rights. It was Biden's polling numbers were going in the tank. So what happens normally when that happens to a president in the U.S.? They go to war. Okay, it's the classic wag the dog. So they came out in December, January, playing around with voting rights that they weren't serious about, and then he shifted to Ukraine. And now Biden is now a presidential great leader. No one's talking about the grinding poverty in the U.S. No one's talking about the plight of the working class in the U.S. But what they are telling us that with this war that was avoidable, like what Margaret said, coming out on the heels of the fact that the working class never recovered from the crisis of 2008 and 2007, 2008. And then the devastation of the COVID situation. Now we have inflation, and they're telling us you have to sacrifice because we have a war. And now, as a consequence of this war, gas prices are going through the roof. So you got higher gas prices, and guess what's going to happen too? Because between Russia and Ukraine, we're talking about almost 30% of wheat production. Food prices are going up. Well, you should sacrifice for that for freedom. So this is the manipulation game they're playing. This whole notion about Putin being worse than Hitler. Look, what happens is this. Anybody that brings to the European environment the kinds of normalized behavior that the Western white supremacist gangsters have been using in the colonial world, they become the very embodiment of evil, okay? And that's what we have now with this whole Putin thing. They tell you all that, the Russians are attempting, that they are focusing on civilians, okay? This is a country of 44 million people. How many civilians have died? As precious as those individuals are, less than 1,000. Compare that to when the Israelis go into Gaza. How many people died when the Israelis went into Gaza, a place with 1.5 million people? 2,000 people were murdered by the Israelis in a matter of a few weeks. We're in the third week of this conflict and less than 1,000 civilians. If they were targeting civilians, it'd be thousands of people dead. Don't let them play you. Don't let them manipulate you. This is not, we got to be clear again about who our enemies are and what we need to be doing. We are catching hell from this backward capitalist system, and they want to divert us away from that to fighting for Ukraine. Why? Because the Western media has put that in front of our faces, and that's all we're talking about now. But we say don't fall for it.
So this is my question, and you've been speaking to this already, and certainly this whole conversation or what you're saying can apply across the board, regardless of our socioeconomic status, our ethnicity. But having said that, okay, let me take a step back just for a second and add some more context to the question that I'm going to ask. One of the things that I do know is that there's probably a wider degree or larger degree of skepticism among African Americans regarding this conflict. And of course, that's rooted in a historical skepticism of what the United States government and its corporate media says versus what it does. However, there's a large cross-section of African Americans who have kind of embraced the official narrative and are, quote unquote, standing with Ukraine in a way that they never did with the Palestinians or the Iraqis or the Syrians or the Yemeni, et cetera. What would be your message specifically? And of course, again, this can apply to everyone, but specifically, what would you say to African Americans or African people more broadly who kind of embrace the official US government corporate narrative of this conflict?
Well, where to begin? I would hope that people would understand that they like who they like because they're told to. They dislike who they dislike because they're told to. You're told this one is a terrorist, they deserve to die. This one is your friend. It's a terrible thing if they die. Out as Ajamu just pointed out, the things we're being told about these battles as they go on, and the downplaying of US and NATO war crimes, that some of which he already alluded to. So I would hope people would see that they are being manipulated. But bottom line, I would hope that people would see their own self-interest. Is this something that you want your friend or relative to die for? Is this a country that you know anything about? Why are you being told? I mean, we should ask ourselves, well, why am I being told that I have to love Ukraine all of a sudden? Just a few years ago, we would get, if you were paying attention and you wanted to know about Ukraine, they would tell you about the oligarchic control. They would tell you about the fascist influences. They would tell you about Zelensky's weaknesses. They would tell you these things, but all of a sudden you don't hear about it anymore. So our goal is to speak out as much as we can, while we can, as long as we have these platforms available to us. But unfortunately, there's been a lot of damage done over the years to Black people, to get us to identify with our government. Barack Obama being president certainly accelerated that terrible phenomenon. But so we've got our work cut out for us. But that makes it all the more important for us to speak out as long as we can. But there's another problem with Black people, and that's the capture of the Democratic Party. and having a Democrat in the White House. But as we've already discussed, their failures, particularly directed at us, the people who support them the most, still their most loyal, I guess that's the word, of all the Democratic Party constituencies. I would hope that people would wake up and use at least some common sense and understand, even if you don't have all of the information that we've discussed tonight, that people use the common sense that they once had and see how they are being played, and in a very, very dangerous way.
You're muted, Ajamu.
Sorry. Yes, we have to ask those critical questions because our future is at stake. And it's a very difficult time, and we have to ask those very serious and difficult questions because many of us haven't really had to think seriously about our relationship to this state in quite some time. But we need to. We need to put back at the center of our concerns the question of peace and the connection of peace to justice. You know, we all know the slogan, no justice, no peace. And that is a very important one, but for justice, we know we have to fight for it. So, you know, we want to, unfortunately, we have to struggle in order to bring about the conditions that we need to have in order to survive and to be in a place to, in fact, thrive going forward. Let me read a quote that captures, when we talk about peace, that captures really the objective of what we mean. You know, when we talk about peace as African people, you know, we operated from what we refer to as the Black radical peace tradition, and that's a little bit different than some of the appeals to peace that we see coming from the majority community in the U.S. When we talk about peace, let me read this. The Black radical tradition says that peace is not the absence of conflict, but rather the achievement by popular struggle and self-defense of a world liberated from the interlocking issues of global conflict, nuclear armament and proliferation, unjust war, and subversion through the defeat of global systems of oppression that include colonialism, imperialism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. So for us, the Black radical peace tradition, we center the structural relationships, and we understand that in order to have peace, we have to transform those relationships. In order to transform those relationships, we have to build independent political power to, in fact, do that. Because we have to struggle and we have to defeat those powerful forces that control the state, that are committed to ensuring that there will be no peace. Because for them, peace, in fact, is a threat, because they use and are dependent on violence.
Now I'm going to go back to the chat, and we'll go in a different direction, and we're going to combine two questions as well. I think the questions may be from the same person, but you spoke to this earlier a little bit, Mr. Baraka. Is the Russian government acting as an imperial power when it is trying to maintain its power and expand through violence? And is there any concern you have about far-right fascist movements in Russia? Are they going to be bolstered by this conflict?
That's a good question. On the issue of the imperialist nature of the Russian state, let me say this. Let's look at some empirical data. The U.S. that engineered this conflict, as we say, has a gross domestic product valued of around $21 trillion. Okay. What is the GDP of the Russian Federation? 1.5 trillion. The idea that, because the question kind of implies, and we've seen this debate around the country, there's this sort of equivalency between the US and what we know as US imperialism and something called Russian imperialism. But when you look at the empirical data, you have to conclude that for the Russians to have engaged in what they engaged in with this war, that their concerns had to be pretty serious. It couldn't just be the notion of some type of imperialist expansion, especially knowing what the consequence was going to be with the imposition of these economic sanctions. They understood that the US was looking for a pretext for sanctions. And they understood that if they engaged in this kind of activity, that these sanctions would be quite severe. But they did that. And we think they may have done that because they in fact sincerely believe that the activities of the US operating through its puppet government in Ukraine to in effect make Ukraine a de facto member of NATO by shipping all of these advanced weapons, NATO advisors, the encouragement of mercenaries, that and with the presence and the existence of these growing neo-Nazi forces, that it represented an existential threat to Russia. And one has to consider that as a possibility because, again, of this unequalness of the objective economic realities and the severity of what has resulted from this conflict. So, whether or not they have some other kinds of considerations, I really don't know. All I know that basically is that the U.S. with its 800 to 1,000 foreign bases, with a military budget that's 15 times or so or 10 times or so the U.S. budget. I don't see the Russians as being necessarily politically suicidal, and so they had to be a basis for them to launch the activities that they launched. And there's another element to that question that I may not get to. Or did I?
Is there any concern that you have about far-right fascist movements in Russia?
Yeah. I think the primary issue for me is, in fact, the far-right far-right elements in Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine had state power. So I separate the far-right and neo-Nazi movements, organizations that don't have state power. That's why I make the argument that while the liberals and neoliberals had you all focus on Trump, for me, the real totalitarian elements were in fact the neoliberals that in fact control the state. And as Margaret talked about, and we all know what's happening now, even though some of us agree with this, I don't, but the many people agree with these neoliberals that control the state, that are the ones that are in alignment with big tech, that they are involved in a systematic process of reducing the range of acceptable information, that they are the ones that are determining what kind of information and analysis is disseminated through their private networks, They are engaged in straight up censorship. It started off, of course, with them pretending like they were concerned about the far right, but we all knew that the real objective and real target was going to be the left. That's what they're really concerned with. They will align with the far right, as Ukraine represents. In December of 2021, there was a vote in the United Nations condemning the glorification of Nazism, the symbols and speech related to Nazism. The entire world voted for that to be something that they would have a concern with, that they would reject. Only 2 nations voted against that resolution condemning the glorification of neo-Nazism: Ukraine and the United States of America. So my concern is with the neoliberal right and understanding that this capitalist class, if push comes to shove, they will align themselves with more extremist right-wing elements and rule. Because when we talk about fascism, we're talking about basically a capitalist reform. It's not about, you know, these bad Hitler movies people watch. It ain't about just crazy, wild Trumpian type people. It is a class relationship, a structural relationship, okay? It's about capitalism, saving and perpetuating capitalism. That's what fascism is. It's capitalism. So no, I'm not concerned about those elements in Russia. To me, those are secondary contradictions. I'm concerned about the primary contradiction, which for me is in fact the neoliberal right in control of this state. They are the ones that are creating and intensifying the fascism that we all have been exposed to, but has been normalized because it didn't affect the entire population. But now they are moving toward a more comprehensive neo-fascism as a consequence of the economic crisis that they are now experiencing.
Yeah, I just want to add one thing. I don't have anything to add to what Ajamu said, but just another thing. I think a lot of this, well, Russia is imperialist too. It's a dodge. People do not want to take the time to find out this history. And I think a lot of it is liberals who don't want to oppose the United States. And so in their cowardice, they look for something. Well, you know, Russia, they're not so great. They got oligarchs or whatever their argument is. A lot of that is just a dodge to keep from looking seriously at this and to keep from having to render a judgment against the United States, because it seems pretty clear to me, if you look at this history, you at the very least you will understand why Russia acted as it did. And that means you can no longer follow this cartoonish depiction of this situation. So a lot of people are asking that, but frankly, they're not doing it with a lot of honesty.
So one issue that I would like for both of you to speak to is a conversation that's definitely happening in the Black world. And that is the treatment of African immigrants and students in Ukraine and the problems that they have with leaving Ukraine and the difference in the ways that they're being treated as opposed to Ukrainian refugees seeking to leave Ukraine. So can you speak to that reality that African immigrants are facing in Ukraine?
Well, we've all seen it by now. It's all over social media that Black people have been impeded in their doing what they have the right to do, to leave the country, and it's very clearly racist. It raises another issue for me, the fact that African nations, some Caribbean nations, people have to leave their countries in order to get opportunities. I think that's something that should never be far from our thoughts when we see Black people being having to leave their countries, having to go all over the world only to be mistreated. I know that's a bigger issue, but it's something that comes to my mind. But this is all a racist project, isn't it? I mean, if you look at the people who get sympathy, the worthy victim, the unworthy victim, the fact that people say, you know, we can't believe this is happening in Europe to, you know, blonde people or whatever. It's just rank racism, and it's also a lie. They're covering up what U.S. and NATO, speaking of aggression, what they did in the former Yugoslavia in the 90s during the Clinton administration. So if it suits them, they will treat white people badly as well. But I, you know, and we see the Ukrainian refugees being welcomed into other European countries, but that's going to create problems there too. I think that's going to create some contradictions in these countries who ordinarily don't like to welcome refugees. I think the welcome mat may not be so permanent. So I think that's something we'll have to watch out for. I won't be surprised if the goodwill does not last.
I agree. That is, we saw the images, and no one was surprised if you understand the nature of many of these Eastern European nations, that they would discriminate against people of color and African people specifically, because it was African people, it was people from India and other parts of the global South. That is the nature of those societies, unfortunately. So, you know, we weren't surprised about that at all. Just like we weren't surprised that that the Ukrainian situation has received such an enormous amount of attention by the Western press. And again, you know, and we hate doing this, but you have to do it to give it some context. When you compare what is in fact unfolding, as horrific as it might be, because war is always horrific, when you compare that to the other criminal activity by the West, it pales in comparison. How many, but look at the contradiction. How many people can remember seeing some images coming from the war in Yemen? Okay, you know, some in-depth analysis or images coming from you know, the people who were under the bombs of the Saudis in support of the U.S. How many people know that the U.S. is helping to enforce a naval blockade against Yemen that has resulted in the most serious humanitarian crisis on the planet? How many people can name three cities that were completely destroyed by the U.S. In the so-called Middle East? You know, they talk about, you know, that the Russians have stalled out because they haven't stormed the cities. Because see, from the U.S. experience, when they attack a city, it is shock and awe all over again. Okay, they don't play. There's no real consideration for civilian life. You know, when they first started their attack on Serbia, they destroyed 20 buildings in less than an hour in the first when they launched their attack. So, you know, but if you get 24/7 coverage and all these morality plays and all of that, then you would think that this is the only thing happening in the world. But I'm sitting here in the global South. People here are just thinking about Ukraine. You know, they have a range of contradictions that we're trying to deal with here in the global South. And so people are confused or obsessed with what's happening in Ukraine. But because of the Eurocentrism, you know, they talk about the world is this, the world's concerned. The European world is 10% of the population. But the arrogance and the narcissism of European thought, everything that happens in Europe is magnified in 10 times, you know. So yeah, so you know, you make that connection between the discrimination against the students and this naked Eurocentrism by the media and the concerns by the U.S. government and European nations, and you paint a picture of naked white supremacy.
So the final question in the chat is a good question, I think, to end this discussion on. So in your answer to this question, please provide your closing statement, your closing remarks to wrap up this conversation. But the last question in the chat is, how can this Ukraine-Russia moment serve to educate and organize the African/Black masses here in America and the diaspora?
Well, that's a big question, but I think Ajamu covered it. And actually the diaspora is aware of what's going on. We're told that, Putin's isolated. Anybody the US doesn't like, we're told is isolated and nobody likes them. Well, that's just not true. There are billions of people all over the world who, if not supportive of the action that Russia has taken, are not condemning it at the very least. We have we reprinted an article in Black Agenda Report last week about African nations and their votes in the United Nations and how so many of them chose not to condemn Russia. So people in the diaspora are well informed. They do know the contradictions. They do know the history of US and NATO aggressions. And they are not fooled by this effort to paint a picture of virtue on the part of the US and its allies. So people are well aware. Nations all over the world have varying opinions about this, or they're supportive. So I think that question is probably, I don't know if you just meant people in the US, it's people in this country who are the ones who are less informed. But the rest of the world, the global South, the African diaspora are far more familiar and far better able to analyze this situation.
We are an African people, and we are at war. And what that means is that our historic task is to build the power that we have to build in order to live in a way that allows us to fully develop our human faculties, to build a society that allows us to, in fact, breathe, that helps us to connect ourselves with the work and the struggles of other non-European people who are struggling for self-determination and for transformation. What we have to do is, in fact, build our own independent power, to connect ourselves with other colonized people, with other working class people in this country and globally. We understand that this backward, racist, vicious, capitalist, imperialist system represents the major enemy of collective humanity. And we have to struggle to defeat this power. So, this conversation we're having tonight is an important conversation, and we hope people continue with this discussion. We hope that you go to the Black Alliance for Peace and look up the Ukraine page that we have. It has all of the information that you'll need in more detail regarding Ukraine and regarding NATO and the demands that we are advancing. But beyond the Ukraine, we say we have to decenter Europe and keep the focus on on imperialism, because as we're looking at Ukraine, we know that people are engaged in ongoing struggle in Venezuela, in Bolivia, in our community. You know, we want to struggle against the transfer of military forces, military weapons from the U.S. military to the police. The process of militarizing the police force. You know, we want to build alternative, independent, community-based organizations where we control all of our community institutions. We want people to understand that we have to struggle and we have to win. That's our only task that we have to embrace, that we have to advance, and it's something that we hope that people will commit themselves to this, that you go to the Black Agenda Report and read, that you organize community teach-ins, that in your professors, in your classrooms, that you challenge young people to commit themselves or to consider themselves being a part of this movement, that you join the Black Alliance of Peace or you join some other organization, that you are committed to sacrificing and supporting your people, because you are standing on the shoulders of generations of our people who engage in opposition. So I say, and we say, as a Black Alliance of Peace, thank you for inviting us. Thank you for this conversation, and commit yourself to the struggle for the power of all of our people. And we say in the Black Alliance of Peace, don't be hesitation. Don't hesitate to stand with boldness and conviction. Don't compromise and don't retreat. Stand yourself, stand your ground, and know that in fact we can win.
Thank you. I don't have a a lot to add, except to say, this is a turning point in history. We say that very often. The date February 24th, 2022 is one that's going to go down in history. And we owe it to ourselves to understand what's going on. And I would say in general to most USians, time to grow up, time to stop listening to BS, time to stop trusting people who you clearly cannot trust. And it's time to see things, to at least be willing to see things in a different way, because to do otherwise is to go down to a defeat, and for this country to be harmed. It's already starting. The US has sanctioned itself in its effort to harm Russia. Yes, they've done damage to Russia, but they've done damage to themselves as well. And if, Americans always talk about living in a democracy. Well, what does that mean? It shouldn't just mean that you get to vote every few years and end up with the same thing. It should mean that you're taking part in the system. It should mean that you use the agency that you have, because this is a moment that will not be forgotten. There are certain things that are never going to be the same after this in some good ways, but we also live in a system which we cannot trust. And this happened in part because we have a group of people who are, among other things, not very smart. Yes, they're trying to protect certain interests. Yes, they're trying to protect capitalism, but they're also not very smart. And it's a dangerous moment for these people to be in control and be able to wield great power and create a very dangerous situation for the entire world. So everybody has to step up. And I thank everyone for joining. This is the kind of thing you're supposed to be doing to educate yourself so that you can be clear on what's happening. And I thank you again, Adisa, and I thank you, Kaya, for bringing us here tonight.
And thank you. One of the reasons why we're having this program is because these voices, or our voices, have really been silenced. So I thought that it was important for us to have this conversation and offer dissent, because not everyone has embraced the corporate narrative and the USian, I've never heard or used that term before, but I like it, the USian narrative of the Russian-Ukraine conflict. And I've been so frustrated with not only being silenced on so many levels, but these voices not being heard. And without question, Ajamu, Baraka, and Margaret, Kimberley are among the most important and voices dealing with Black radical perspectives, not only on this particular issue, but on many, many issues that are relevant and important to Black people, to progressives, and really to the global community, if I'm being honest. So I thank you so very much for joining us, and I hope that my colleagues, my students of SDSU recognize the monumental discussion that this has been. So thank you so much for joining us, and I really appreciate you all taking the time to lead this discussion and have this discussion with us. So thank you. And also thank you for our guests for joining us in this very, very important conversation. Continue to have this conversation because it's so important for us to have. So thank you and good night.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you. No compromise, no retreat.
Power to the people.
Power to the
Putting
people.
Glenn now.